Moses, the mediator. When the children of Israel made that golden calf, and the Lord was about ready to be done with them, Moses stood in the way and said, "No, if you're going to take anyone, take me." But still, God had to live with his people. Instead of a golden calf, they had a tabernacle, and the tabernacle was built, and the desert wanderings happened. And in the book of Deuteronomy, they got ready to go into the promised land. A whole generation died in the wilderness. And their children were the ones who would go up with Joshua into the promised land. And indeed, the Lord brought them into the promised land, and they settled in the promised land. But in the book of Joshua, they just sort of settled in bits and places in the promised land, established themselves, but the Lord said, you really have to clear this out, or the people around are going to be a problem. And the people were a problem. Then you have the book of Judges. And what the book of Judges is a cycle of Israel continuing to fall into various kinds of addiction and slavery. Last week we talked about slavery and addiction. And the cycle throughout the book of Judges goes like this. They forget their marriage to God, and they fall into slavery and bondage. It's sort of like Egypt, but they're in the bondage and slavery in the promised land. And then, like in Exodus, they cry out to God, and God raises up a judge, and through the judge, God rescues them. But then they forget, and the cycle goes around and around and around. And the book of Judges is a very painful book, because it seems that things just get worse and worse and worse. Towards the end of the book of Judges, there's a story. And the story typifies what is happening. A lot of people remember Samson from the book of Judges and Gideon from the book of Judges. Nobody remembers these people because even their names aren't given. In those days, Israel had no king. This is a refrain you'll find again and again and again in the book of Judges. There's no king. Nobody's keeping order. Israel keeps forgetting. Now a Levite, if you remember last week, it was the Levites who rallied to Moses. Levites were the ones set apart to take special care of the tabernacle and of the interests of God. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem to Judah. Now today we don't use that word concubine, but if you see a couple living together without marriage, that's roughly equivalent to the situation of a concubine. The man has less responsibility towards the woman, and she, doesn't get as much out of it. In the ancient world, concubines, the greatest interest was often, obviously, the sexual companionship, but also childbearing. But a concubine does not have the status of a wife. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem, Judah. Now, all these place names are important because this isn't actually the main story we're reading together, but this story is background to understand the main story. After she had been there for 4 months, her husband, not really her husband, went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servants and 2 donkeys. She took him into her parents' home, and when the father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. So I'm going to skip a few verses, but basically, every time he wants to leave with the woman and the donkeys and his servant, the man delays him. Then the man, with his concubine and his servant, got up to leave his father-in-law. The woman's father said, "Now look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. The day is nearly over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning you can get up." But every morning he was sort of delaying him. But unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went towards Jebus, that is Jerusalem, with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. When they were near Jebus, and the day was almost gone, the servant said to the master, "Come, let's stop at this city of the Jebusites and spend the night." Now, later when we meet David, he will attack and take the city of Jebus, and it will become Jerusalem, but it's still in the hands of the Jebusites, the Canaanites. His master replied, "No, we won't go to any city whose people are not Israelites. We will go to Gibeah." Gibeah is of the tribe of Benjamin. "Come, let us try to reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night in one of those places." Remember the word Ramah. So they went on, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah and Bethlehem, and they stopped to spend the night. They went and sat in the city square, but no one took them in for the night. Now, there weren't any hotels, and these were villages, but the assumption was in a village, if it was a good village full of good people and proper people, they would extend hospitality. Now, it's interesting that the story begins with the father of the concubine extending a lot of hospitality, in fact, in some ways too much, manipulatively, and now they're in a village of the tribe of Benjamin, and no one in the village is extending hospitality. Now, as the story unfolds, you will recognize this story from an older story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the point is, Israel is no better. That evening, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, that's where the Levite was from. So in other words, it wasn't good enough to be a Levite. It wasn't good enough to be an Israelite. Some old man with some probably connection to this man, apart from Gibeah, stops, who was living in Gibeah. The inhabitants of the place were Benjamites. Came in from his work in the fields. When he looked and saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? Where have you come from?" He answered, "We are on our way from Bethlehem in Judea to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim where I live. I have been in Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going to the house of the Lord. No one has taken me in for the night. We have both straw and fodder for our donkeys and bread and wine for ourselves and our servants, me, the woman, and the young man with us. We don't need anything." He's basically saying, look, all we need is a secure place to sleep. You don't have to give us any food. We'll take care of ourselves, just the bare minimum. "You are welcome in my house," the old man said. "Let me supply whatever you need. Only don't spend the night in the square." So he took him into his house and fed his donkeys, and after they had washed their feet, they had something to eat. Now again, you notice they were in Bethlehem. The story is around, at this point, a young woman from Bethlehem. And of course, Bethlehem is the name that you all remember. Notice the repetition of these names in the Bible. They're connected intentionally. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Wow, what does this sound like? Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." Now, this causes a lot of questions. What is the reason they want this man? Do they really want him just for sex? Or is this another issue? Is this another situation, perhaps more like, let's say, a prison situation where they want to make a point about dominance, and they want to do it brutally? But now, the older man, who's not originally from there, you can think about Lot moving into Sodom, not originally from there. All of these parallels are set up in the story intentionally. Even what happens next. The owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing." Now, this expectation about hospitality was throughout the ancient Near East. It wasn't just Israel that had this expectation. This was basically what it meant to be a good person, that you would extend hospitality to someone in need because someday you might be in need and someone would help you out. And then he says this, "Look here is my virgin daughter and his concubine." Oh, yeah, I will bring them out to you, and you can use them and do with them as you wish. If you remember the story of Sodom, the men of the town turned down the offer. Here, but for this man, don't do such an outrageous thing. But the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and set her outside to them. This woman that he wanted so badly, he traveled all the way across Israel to argue with her father, to get her back. And now he's going to take her back to Ephraim after she had cheated on him and she had abandoned him. Now he's sort of bringing her back, and it's super unclear. What are the relationships like here? What is the treatment of women in this place? So the man, to save his own neck, throws his concubine outside. And they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. When her master got up in the morning, notice the change in language, very subtle. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house, with her hands on the threshold. Dagon will be there a little bit later in the book of Samuel. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." Not even, well, what's he going to say? Get up, let's go. Remember, he's a Levite. There was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. When they reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb from limb, into 12 parts, and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it said to one another, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Just imagine, we must do something." Things are so bad. All of this hope that God had for Israel, bring them out into the desert, give them their law, give them manna from heaven, give them quail to eat so they could have meat to eat, give them water, bring them into this land flowing with milk and honey, clear out some of the Canaanites, all of this. And in many ways, they're worse than Sodom. And what follows isn't much better, it's civil war. This is God's project, and it is an utter failure. Now, the next book is the book of Ruth, and that's a book that we love because it's a glimmer of hope, but in it, it's a glimmer of hope that condemns Israel. Because if you read back to Numbers 25, the Moabite women were a big threat. In the book of Ruth, this one Moabite woman basically, together with at least one decent Israelite man, brings a glimmer of hope into the line of David. But the point of the book of Judges is, can you believe a story like this? It's the worst kind of story that people who don't know God at all would shudder from in horror. God's experiment looks like, again, a catastrophe. Remember in Genesis when humanity was just killing each other and God said in Genesis 5, "I regret that I've made them." What will he do now? Will he wipe out Israel? This seems worse than the golden calf. What can God possibly do? Beginning of the book of Samuel. There was a certain man from Ramathaim. Now, there's a lot of debate among scholars about all these names, but basically you'll notice he lives in Ramah, near Gibeah. He's living in the hill country of Ephraim, but he seems to be a Levite. We just had a Levite and a concubine, and his treatment of the concubine is so horrendous, and Gibeah's treatment of the concubine is so horrendous, And she doesn't have much virtue either. There's no good players in that story. Now suddenly another story. And this again will be about a woman. So a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeraham. Oh, we get a name with this one. The son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, and an Ephraimite. Oh, okay, well, this is someone who actually marries the women he sleeps with. He had 2 wives, so he's wealthy. One was named Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Now again, in today's world, where people are really on the fence as to whether they want children, in the ancient world, a woman of status is one who had many children. If a woman didn't have children, well, she didn't have a good future of old age to look for because sons took care of their mothers. And so a woman who had many sons was prized in the community. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. That's where the tabernacle is. Where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Now, there's a lot going on here. Not only do we have the story of the Levite in the background, but we have a wealthy man with 2 wives, and immediately we think of Rachel and Leah, the 2 wives of Jacob, who were rivals for their husband's love based on how many sons they had. And of course, Leah and the concubine slaves all had sons, and Rachel had none, until finally Joseph comes, and when Joseph comes, the other brothers sell him into slavery instead of killing him. Barrenness is a big theme. Sarah was barren. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, was barren. Rachel was barren. Hophni and Phinehas, the tabernacle is there, but we'll learn later in the book Hophni and Phinehas are corrupt. They steal from the sacrifices and they abuse women. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife, Peninnah, and to all her sons and daughters. That's what he should do. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Elkanah is a good man. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. And again, it's Rachel and Leah all over again. If you remember that story, Jacob worked 7 years for Rachel. Laban switches them. So now he's married to Leah, has to work 7 more years for Rachel. Jacob loves Rachel, doesn't care much for Leah. Leah has all these sons to make up for it. In this case, Peninnah is boasting because I'm sure everybody saw when Elkanah gave that double portion. We all know who's his favorite. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her until she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you so downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" And everyone in that culture would know the answer. The answer she had was, "No, you are not." Is this a happy family? Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." She wants this so badly, she's even willing to bargain with God and give the son back. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought that she was drunk. And he said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Things are horrible in Israel, but still, the family's unhappy. Elkanah's not a bad man. Eli's sons are corrupt. He's not a bad man. And here you have this woman who God seems to have intentionally closed her womb, just like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel. God is going to do something, but he's not going to do something in the way anyone imagined God's work. God's going to do something through suffering to somehow try to redeem the catastrophe that is Israel, his project. Early the next morning they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and they went back to their home at, remember I told you to remember it, Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. God remembered Noah, story of the ark. Again and again in the Old Testament, that's the language. God remembered. What did that mean? It didn't mean that God forgot. It meant that God's faithfulness took on flesh. In course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, Because I asked the Lord for him. When her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. Do what seems best to you, her husband Elkanah told her. Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until he was weaned, and at that culture could be 3, 4, 5 years old. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought them to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted him to me what I asked of him. And then this. So I gave him to the Lord, for his whole life will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. This son that she wanted more than anything else, you would think she would hold him and keep him and want him close to her whole life long. But what does she do? He came from the Lord. I asked the Lord for him. I will give him back to the Lord. And this begins the turning of Israel in the book of Samuel. God has his work cut out for him because it's easy to look on Israel and tisk. Are we really much better? It is often our brokenness that drives us to God. It's when we get over our heads, when there's a problem we can't solve, when there's an issue we can't resolve, we don't have the money for it, or it's just inside a person and that person can't be changed, or it's a situation with people around us and there's no way out, and the only thing we have left to do is, like Hannah, go to the Lord and pour our hearts out. And maybe even a semi-blind priest might think we're drunk. Even the rivalries, the insults, the status issues that arise from our culture can be used by God to bring us back to him. Did God give her barrenness so that she would finally find something of more worth than the ancient Near East numerical sons arms race gave? Did she learn something in this process that was even more valuable than a son? Her husband asks, am I not more valuable than 10 sons? No. But she finds something that is. Samuel will be the first step in addressing Israel's perpetual enslavement. King Saul will come. King David will prevail. Samuel will be the final judge in the cycle before the kings. And the kings are going to have their own issues. There's no question about that. But this is a story about God and a woman in a very hostile world. And about how it's precisely the way that she struggles that God uses to redeem the world. We are addicts trying to make a home with God. And if you've ever lived with an addict, you know it can't be done. Last week we talked about us needing a new heart. Just when things get darkest, God sneaks in some new hope. He doesn't flood the world and destroy it. He doesn't bring down fire from Sinai and burn up all the people, because the prayers of one woman, he gives a son, and a new thing begins. It's almost always through our suffering that God finally gets our attention, and that new heart begins to grow. Hannah is a hero, more than Eli, more than Elkanah, even though they play important supporting roles. She knows where to turn with her sorrows. She works hard not to let God get off the hook, and she doesn't storm away. You can see that in the book of Job. God doesn't mind wrestling with us. In fact, he would far rather have us wrestle with him than just throw up our hands and try and run away from him. Even her reward is costly. Through her costly sacrifice, God's mission moves forward. Now, we didn't read it, but if you read the next chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 2, you have this song of Hannah. And then if you listen to Bethlehem, to Ramah, to the shape of this story, suddenly, and you read the song of Hannah in the book of Luke, you read the song of Mary, and you think about Bethlehem, and a boy baby, and a new start to new life. Pours out his heart to God in his sorrows in Gethsemane, lays down his life for his friends, gives back to God what he received, and gives us what he received. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body, broken for you." That night in Gethsemane, so much stress, sweated blood, taken by those he came to save. What does he do? Does he turn in wrath and anger? He feeds his flock, and he forgives his tormentors. This body is for you.